The bulldozers came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before they had any legal right to be there. Margaret Ellison stood at the edge of her fence line, watching the surveyor's orange flags flutter across land her husband had died defending, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only betrayal brings, that someone wanted her gone badly enough to break the law to make it happen. 6 months earlier, a man named Richard Colton had knocked on her door wearing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd offered her $40,000 for 80 acres of what he called tired old dirt. Margaret had laughed, not out of contempt, but disbelief. This was the land where her husband Walter had proposed to her beneath a walnut tree that still stood behind the barn. It was where her children had learned to walk, where Walter had taken his last breath in the bedroom upstairs, surrounded by the fields he'd spent 40 years working. She said no. That single word would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted, one that would eventually expose something buried in the county archives for over a century, something that would make Richard Colton's $40,000 offer look like the punchline to a joke he never saw coming. If you believe ordinary people deserve justice, no matter how powerful the opposition, subscribe for more inspiring true stories like this one. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you in the comments. Margaret's farm sat at the edge of Hartwell County, a patchwork of fields that had grown corn and soybeans since Walter's grandfather first cleared the land in 1911. It wasn't much to look at. The barn leaned slightly to the west. The fences needed mending. But every cracked board held a memory, and Margaret had promised Walter in his final week that she would never let it go. "It's just dirt to them," Walter had whispered, his hand trembling in hers. "But it's everything to us." She hadn't fully understood what he meant. Not yet. After she refused Colton's offer, the calls started. Then the letters from a company called Ridgeline Development, each one slightly less polite than the last. Then came the whispers around town, that Margaret was a stubborn old woman standing in the way of jobs, progress, a new shopping complex that would bring money to a county that desperately needed it. Neighbors who'd known her for 30 years began crossing the street to avoid conversation. "You're being unreasonable, Mrs. Ellison," Colton told her at a town meeting, his voice smooth as poured concrete. "This development could employ 200 people. Are 80 acres of soybeans really worth more than that?" The room murmured in agreement. Margaret sat alone in the third row, her hands folded, saying nothing. But inside, a question was forming that she couldn't yet answer. Why was a mid-sized developer offering triple the market rate for land that, by his own admission, produced mediocre yields? The pressure escalated in ways that felt engineered rather than coincidental. The county suddenly flagged her barn for code violations that had existed, unremarked, for a decade. Her property taxes were reassessed upward by nearly 30%, a number her accountant called statistically improbable for a rural parcel. A rumor spread that Margaret was secretly planning to sell to a landfill company, a lie so specific it had to have originated from someone with resources and intent. Then came the bulldozers, weeks ahead of any permit, chewing into the access road at the edge of her property before her lawyer, a tired but determined young woman named Priya Nair, obtained an emergency injunction to stop them. "They're testing you," Priya said, spreading paperwork across Margaret's kitchen table. "They want to see how much you'll tolerate before you break." "Why me?" Margaret asked. "Why this land? There are a dozen other parcels around here just as flat, just as empty." Priya frowned at a survey map, tracing the boundary lines with her finger. "That's what I'd like to know too." The answer, they would soon discover, was buried in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in generations. It was Margaret's grandson, Ethan, a graduate student studying environmental geology, who noticed it first. Home for the summer, he'd been sorting through Walter's old paperwork in the attic when he found a brittle, water-stained survey from 1938, commissioned by the state during a Depression-era mineral assessment program that had mapped much of the county's subsurface geology before quietly losing funding and fading into obscurity. The document referenced something called the Hartwell Aquifer Formation, and beneath a layer of technical jargon, a startling note from the original surveyor: unusually high concentrations of a mineral called lithium-bearing clay, discovered directly beneath what was now Margaret's western field. "Grandma," Ethan said, spreading the fragile pages across the table, his voice unsteady, "this is huge. Lithium is one of the most valuable minerals in the world right now. It's in every phone battery, every electric car. If this deposit is real, and it's as large as this survey suggests, this isn't a soybean farm. It's sitting on a resource worth potentially tens of millions of dollars." Margaret stared at the yellowed paper, her mind reeling. Walter had never mentioned this. Perhaps he'd never known. Perhaps his own father, superstitious about disturbing the land, had simply buried the report and never spoken of it again. But if the survey was accurate, it explained everything. Colton's lowball offer, the manufactured code violations, the bulldozers arriving before permits were finalized. Ridgeline Development wasn't building a shopping complex at all. They intended to acquire the land cheaply, quietly extract the minerals through a shell subsidiary, and profit enormously while Margaret and the county never learned the truth. There was only one problem. An 88-year-old survey wasn't legal proof of anything. They needed verification, and they needed it before Ridgeline found another way to force her out. Priya brought in an independent geologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Alvarez, who specialized in exactly this kind of subsurface mineral analysis. For 3 tense days, her team drilled careful test cores across Margaret's western field, while Margaret watched from the porch, hardly breathing, half convinced the entire discovery might dissolve into nothing. It didn't. The 1938 survey undersold it, if anything, Dr. Alvarez explained, spreading lab results across the same kitchen table where Priya had once spread her legal warnings. This is one of the richer lithium clay deposits identified in this region in the last decade. And there's something else, Mrs. Ellison, because this deposit sits partially beneath a documented historic homestead site. Any extraction here would trigger state historic preservation review. Nobody can simply come in and start digging, not without your consent and not without answering to the state. Margaret finally understood why Walter's family had never sold, why some quiet instinct had told 3 generations of Ellisons to hold on to land that made no obvious financial sense. They hadn't known about the lithium, but they'd known the land itself was worth protecting. News of the discovery reached Colton within days. Small counties keep few secrets, and his confident mask finally cracked. He arrived at Margaret's door not with an offer this time, but with something close to panic, proposing a partnership, a joint venture, anything to salvage what he now realized had slipped through his fingers. "We could still make this work for both of us," he said. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "You had 6 months to be honest with me, Mr. Colton. You chose intimidation instead." The legal reckoning that followed was not the dramatic courtroom spectacle of film and television, but something quieter and, in its own way, more satisfying. County investigators, alerted by Priya's formal complaint, uncovered evidence that Ridgeline had commissioned its own private mineral survey 8 months earlier, before ever making contact with Margaret, confirming they'd known about the lithium deposit all along. Concealing that knowledge while making a lowball purchase offer violated state disclosure laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of predatory land acquisition. Ridgeline settled rather than face prosecution, paying substantial penalties and formally withdrawing every claim to Margaret's property. The fraudulent code violations were reversed. Her tax assessment was corrected. The bulldozed section of road was repaired at the company's expense. But Margaret's story didn't end with a settlement check. Working with Dr. Alvarez, the County Historical Society, and a sustainable mining cooperative, Margaret established a limited, carefully regulated extraction partnership that preserved the historic homestead, protected the walnut tree where Walter had proposed, and funneled a portion of profits into a community trust supporting local farmers, facing exactly the kind of predatory pressure she'd once faced alone. She didn't become the kind of wealthy that changes a person. She became the kind of secure that lets a person keep doing what they always did, just with less fear. The soybeans still grow in the eastern fields every summer. The barn still leans slightly to the west, though it's been properly repaired now. And sometimes in the evening, Margaret walks out to the walnut tree and remembers Walter's words. It's just dirt to them, but it's everything to us. He'd been right about the second part. It turned out he'd been right about the first part too, just not in the way either of them ever imagined.